If everyone will please find a seat, we're going to start in just 1 minute. Please find a seat. Thank you. Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Works every time. Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Civil War Roundtable. As you all know, the Union League Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Everything that we do is inspired by that first line in your bylaws: every member shall support the Constitution. And what we try to do through our civics programs, our scholarships, programs like tonight's program, our exhibits, is to create more educated, better engaged citizen leaders. And that is our goal. So a few housekeeping items before we begin our program. Please turn off your cell phone. And I would ask you to actually not just look like you're going to turn it off. We had several cell phones go off at really bad places in our last program. We want to try to avoid that, or silence them if that's what you'd like to do. We will have a little time for questions at the end of our program. Please use the microphone. We are streaming live, so we need you to use the microphone. And as always, 3 sentences max, and if you can't put a question mark on the end of it, you have failed. And Kira's been keeping track of you, so we won't ask you to ask a question the next time. So she's very good about things. So please keep your questions to questions and keep them short. One of the things we do is we present exhibits. We have a brand new exhibit down in the Hewer Room in the Heritage Center. It's called A City Divided, the Civil War of Philadelphia and the Union League. And in this exhibit, we attempt to tell the complicated story of Philadelphia's divided loyalties. Divided on the issue of slavery, and bitterly divided also about whether the Constitution itself is a pro or anti-slavery document. And if you like tonight's talk, you're going to love the exhibit. So I encourage you to come down and see this exhibit, which is, I think, really relevant not just to tonight's talk, but to a lot of things going on in our world today. I want to thank all of you who support all the work we do, including our exhibit, and I want to thank most especially the chair of our development committee, Dr. Gary Dorsheimer, who I just saw a moment ago. Gary, thank you. Thank you, Gary. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, James Oakes. Oakes teaches at the graduate, or I understand teaches until today, is that right? Tomorrow, your last class. Okay, so still teaches at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and is undoubtedly one of the foremost Civil War historians. Incredibly, this is his first visit to the Union League of Philadelphia. I hope it's not his last. He's a two-time winner of the Lincoln Prize for his works, The Radical and the Republican, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, The Triumph of Anti-Slavery Politics, and Freedom National, The Destruction of Slavery in the United States, 1861-1865. His latest book, The Crooked Path to Abolition, Abraham Lincoln and the Anti-Slavery Constitution, is the topic of tonight's talk. And it is, I believe, a brilliant work, scholarly and thorough, yet accessible and relevant in so many ways to our nation's current debates about our history and how our history should inform our present. I love this one reviewer, and I was reading reviews today. They're all great, but one is, many books, quote, many books discuss Lincoln and abolition, but this is among the best, end quote. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome James Oakes.
Okay, make sure it's turned off. A little housekeeping. Thank you for that very generous introduction. It's a really a delight to be here. It's an honor to be here in this beautiful building, commemorating a very noble cause. And if you don't like the talk, you'll still like the exhibit. Let me just get some of this. My talk's, it's a little longer than it's supposed to be, so I'm from New York, I'm gonna talk New York style, if you don't mind, which is to say, fast. In the summer of 1854, the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society sent out word of a large gathering to be held at Harmony Grove in Framingham, 16 miles from Boston, on the 4th of July. For 50 cents, picnickers were offered special trains to and from the grounds. Handbills blared the theme of the meeting, "No Slavery," and promised addresses by eminent speakers, among them Sojourner Truth and Henry David Thoreau. But the speech that attracted the most attention and left the most lasting impression was delivered by the great abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Much of what Garrison said was familiar to all opponents of slavery. July 4th is, of course, the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and even the most mainstream of mainstream anti-slavery politicians would have nodded in agreement as Garrison insisted that the famous phrase, "all men are created equal," meant that every human being was equally entitled to the natural right of freedom, and that slavery was a violation of that sacred principle. When Garrison held up a copy of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and set it on fire, those same mainstream politicians might have winced, but they would not have disagreed with the sentiment. They all hated the law. Some wanted it revised. Some thought it should be repealed outright. Some thought the fugitive slave law was unconstitutional. And that is where most anti-slavery folks parted company with Garrison. He didn't think the Fugitive Slave Act was unconstitutional. He thought it was perfectly consistent with the Constitution. He felt the same way about the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed a few months before, which reopened the Nebraska Territory to slavery. And he felt the same way about the rendition of Anthony Burns, a fugitive slave who had recently been marched through the streets of Boston by federal troops, returning him to slavery in the face of 50,000 protesters. Most of slavery's opponents thought the Kansas-Nebraska Act was inconsistent with the Constitution. Most believed that Anthony Burns had been deprived of his constitutional rights, but not William Lloyd Garrison. None of the recent victories of the so-called slave power, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the rendition of Anthony Burns, none of these were violations of the Constitution, Garrison insisted. If anything, they were caused by the Constitution. The source and parent of all the other atrocities, Garrison declared that day, was the Constitution itself, which he then denounced as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Striking another match, Garrison held up a copy of the US Constitution and set it to flames as well. 6 years later, in Glasgow, Scotland, another great abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, gave a very different speech. After escaping from slavery in 1838, Douglass moved to New England, where he joined the Garrisonian branch of the abolitionist movement and argued that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. But by the early 1850s, having moved to Rochester and created distance between himself and the Garrisonians, he began to argue a very different interpretation of the Constitution. Far from being a pro-slavery document, Douglass declared, the Constitution was in fact an anti-slavery document. Indeed, it was an abolitionist doctrine. Along with many anti-slavery people, Douglass now held that both the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the 1850 Fugitive Law were unconstitutional. But he also believed that the Constitution gave the federal government the power to abolish slavery everywhere in the United States, not only in the territories, but in the slave states themselves, a position no anti-slavery politician took. It looked like Douglass had leaped from one extreme to the other, from the Constitution as a document that protected slavery always and everywhere, to a document that would abolish slavery always and everywhere as well. Like Frederick Douglass, I used to agree with Garrison. I once published an article in a law review denouncing the founders for their pusillanimous compromises with slavery at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. But then I began working on a book about the relationship between Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, neither of whom agreed with Garrison. Whatever else divided them, both agreed that the Constitution was fundamentally an anti-slavery document. And the more I looked into it, the clearer it became that hardly any anti-slavery folks agreed with Garrison, including the majority of abolitionists. Once I realized this, I started to rethink the whole question of slavery and the Constitution. There were some basic questions I was going to have to ask myself, beginning with, what was this anti-slavery Constitution that nearly all opponents of slavery subscribed to? Were people like Abraham Lincoln deluded? Were they fooling themselves? Were they, as my friend Paul Finkelman would say, better lawyers than they were historians? What he meant was that as historians, what Finkelman meant was that as historians, we all know that Garrison was right, that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. But folks like Lincoln were just very good at conjuring up ingenious legal arguments against slavery, arguments that, alas, bear little or no relationship to historical reality, the reality being a pro-slavery Constitution. I now think that the anti-slavery constitutionalists were better historians than we give them credit for. And that's not because there were no pro-slavery clauses inserted into the Constitution in 1787. There were, but that's not all there were. Nor is there any question that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention reached a number of critical compromises over slavery. But the word compromise implies back and forth, give and take, both sides making concessions to the other. The problem is that scholars tend to treat those concessions not as compromises, but as abject capitulations to slavery. There were indeed pro-slavery and anti-slavery delegates at the Constitutional Convention, and yes, anti-slavery delegates made concessions to the pro-slavery delegates. But, and this is critically important for understanding what was going to happen in 1861, the pro-slavery delegates also made concessions to the anti-slavery delegates. For example, the pro-slavery delegates in Philadelphia wanted to count all the slaves in their states, 100% or 5/5 for purposes of representation. The anti-slavery delegates didn't want any slaves, 0/5 to be counted. Both sides compromised, and the result was the notorious 3/5 clause. Frederick Douglass came to view this as an anti-slavery victory because it gave the southern states an inbuilt incentive to increase their political power by abolishing slavery, at which point 5/5 of the freed people in the southern states would be counted for purposes of representation. My own feeling is that the 3/5 clause was an important pro-slavery concession because it enhanced the power of the slaveholders in both the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. But there were anti-slavery victories as well. The anti-slavery delegates proposed a clause that would allow Congress to halt the importation of slaves from Africa beginning in 1800. This would be the first such national law in the history of the world. The pro-slavery delegates initially threatened to walk out of the convention if any such clause were adopted. In the end, the pro-slavery delegates conceded the point in return for moving the proposed ban from 1800 to 1808. On balance, this was an anti-slavery clause because it resulted in the complete ban on U.S. participation in the international slave trade beginning in 1808, at the very moment the cotton boom was radically increasing the demand for slave labor. There were other implicit compromises. The Constitution authorized Congress to make all needful rules and regulations for the territories, and it was universally understood that this empowered Congress to ban slavery from those territories, as it did in Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. But that same Article 6 contained the nation's first fugitive slave clause, which was then imported into the Constitution, thereby empowering the slaveholders to recapture their fugitive slaves who escaped into the free states. This was a quid pro quo. Congress assumed the power to ban slavery from the territories, and in return, the slaveholders got the right to recapture their fugitive slaves. You can see this in the original wording of Article 6 introduced by Nathan Dane of Massachusetts on July 12, 1787. There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, he proposed, quote, provided always that the person escaping into the territory could be reclaimed by the owner. As we will see, similar wording was incorporated into the Constitution as the Fugitive Slave Clause, thereby giving slaveholders a right to the recovery of their escaped slaves. But what kind of right was it? Was it a common law right of recaption, as Northerners claimed? Or was it, as Southerners would claim, a constitutional right of property? The answer depends on whether the Constitution recognized slaves as persons or as property. We know that at the Constitutional Convention, the slaveholders tried several times to insert language that would recognize slaves as property, but they were repeatedly thwarted by anti-slavery delegates who objected to the idea that the Constitution should in any way recognize a right of what was called property in man. And as a result, the Constitution repeatedly refers to slaves as persons, never as property, even in the 3/5 and fugitive slave clauses. The founders are often criticized with some justice for their euphemistic evasions. They produced a constitution that refers to slavery in several places without ever using the words slave or slavery. On the other hand, the evidence we do have suggests that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention deliberately refused to recognize a constitutional right of property in man. That refusal might have threatened slavery in the southern states, for it would imply that the slaves were entitled to all the rights, privileges, and immunities the Constitution guarantees to all persons. It didn't imply that because of federalism. In this case, what historians call the federal consensus. This was the universally accepted principle that slavery was a state institution, that the federal government had no power to interfere with, that is, abolish slavery in a state where it was legal. Thus, the potential threat of the Constitution's recognition of slaves as legal persons was neutralized by the federalist principle that Congress could not interfere with slavery in states where slavery actually existed. So what should we make of this? I'm a historian, not a constitutional lawyer. I recognize the power of textualism. The problem is that when it comes to slavery, both its defenders and its critics were able to cite the text of the Constitution and claimed that it supported their very different views. And while I agree that we should pay attention to the original meaning of the words in the Constitution, the federal consensus raises vexing problems because it isn't stated anywhere in the text. What is the original meaning of a constitutional principle, slavery was strictly a state institution, that just about everybody endorsed, but which isn't stated anywhere in the Constitution? Moreover, although the federal consensus certainly had pro-slavery implications, it meant that the federal government could never abolish slavery in a state, it also led anti-slavery politicians to call for the complete divorce of the federal government from slavery, that the federal government had no power to protect slavery anywhere outside a slave state. The simple fact is that the Constitution contained both pro-slavery and anti-slavery clauses and was based on principles that could be invoked by both the defenders and opponents of slavery. As the years went by, both sides of the slavery debate cited those clauses and drew inferences from them to develop over time two very different legal traditions: pro-slavery constitutionalism and anti-slavery constitutionalism. It's easy to see how, for example, the power Congress had to regulate slavery in the territories gave rise to a number of questions that anti-slavery Northerners and pro-slavery Southerners answered very differently. Could Congress require Missouri Territory to abolish slavery as a condition for admission to the Union? Could Congress ban slavery from all the territory acquired from Mexico? Should Congress lift the ban on slavery in the Nebraska territories? These are the contentious questions that lead most historians to conclude that the conflict over slavery in the territories was one of the leading causes, if not the leading cause, of the Civil War. It's often said, for example, that the cause of the war was not slavery itself, but merely the expansion of slavery into the territories. I think that's a mistake. I don't think most anti-slavery Northerners were able to separate opposition to slavery's territorial expansion from their opposition to slavery itself. Think about the way anti-slavery constitutionalists framed the issue. By the 1850s, anti-slavery politicians representing the majority of Northerners certainly argued that Congress had the power to ban slavery from the territories. But they also argued that Congress could not constitutionally allow slavery in the territories. Why not? Because slavery, it was said, was so odious a violation of natural rights that it could only exist where positive law, basically statutes, created it. Such laws existed only in the slave states. The Constitution contains no such positive clause actually creating slavery. On the contrary, as the Republican Party platform of 1860 put it, freedom was the natural condition of the territories. The Constitution did not give Congress the power to override the natural condition of freedom in the territories. By contrast, the Constitution did oblige Congress to protect freedom in the territories. States may legalize slavery, but the federal government, it was said, quote, can no more create a slave than a king. Hence, the anti-slavery position was that Congress could not only ban slavery from the territories, it was constitutionally obligated to protect the freedom of anyone in the territories that someone else claims to be a slave. Viewed in this way, the way Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party viewed it, the question of slavery's expansion could not be separated from the question of slavery itself. But of course, there were other ways to look at the issue of slavery in the territories. Pro-slavery constitutionalists, among them Jefferson Davis, saw the matter very differently. Congress, they argued, had no power to ban slavery from the territories. On the contrary, the federal government was constitutionally obligated to protect slavery in the territories. That's because in the pro-slavery interpretation, the Constitution did in fact recognize slave ownership as a right of property. Moreover, states decided what did and did not count as property, and Congress had no choice but to respect those decisions. Slaves then were legal property, and surely the federal government was obligated to protect the right of property anywhere it was sovereign, anywhere the government was sovereign. As John C. Calhoun put it, slavery follows the flag. On American vessels plying the high seas, on U.S. ships in foreign ports, even those ports where slavery was illegal, and of course in the Western territories. But it wasn't only the states that defined slaves as property. As pro-slavery constitutionalists saw it, the Constitution created a right of property in man. Where did the Constitution do that? In the Fugitive Slave Clause. That's why so much of the conflict over slavery depended on that question I mentioned earlier. What kind of right did the Fugitive Slave Clause give the slaveholders? Once again, the text of the Constitution does not clearly answer that question. Here it is. Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, the notorious Fugitive Slave Clause. Quote, "No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such labor or service may be due." At first glance, it's pretty straightforward, despite the legalese. Any slave, referred to here as a person held to service or labor, who escapes from a slave state to a free state cannot be emancipated, discharged from such labor or service, no matter what the laws of the free state say. Instead, the fugitive slave, quote, "shall be delivered up to the owner or the owner's representatives, that is, the person to whom such service or labor is due." So the Constitution pretty clearly gave the slaveholders the right to the return of any of his or her slaves who escaped to a free state. And yet this unambiguously pro-slavery clause is itself riddled with ambiguities that begin with the question I raised earlier. What specific legal right did the clause give the owner of a fugitive slave? Was it a broad constitutional right of property, as the pro-slavery constitutionalists argued, or a narrower common law right of recaption, as the anti-slavery constitutionalists argued? The answer to that question made a huge difference, legally, practically, and politically. If it was a property right, the federal government was obligated to enforce it. If it was a common law right of recaption, it was legally self-enforcing. What does that mean? Traditionally, in English common law, no government authorities are involved in the right of recaption. If you're recapturing property, say your cow wanders off into a neighbor's field, you have a right to go get it. You don't need a sheriff. You don't need a court order. The same was true if you were recapturing a person. If your wife abandons you, your servant or apprentice runs off, you have a right to go get that person. So long as there's no breach of peace, in Blackstone's words, the right of recaption was self-enforcing. That was how the fugitive slaves were traditionally recovered before the Constitution. In 1783, for example, a South Carolina planter sought to recover a number of slaves who had escaped to Massachusetts during the Revolutionary War. Actually, they were brought to Massachusetts by the British during the Revolutionary War. When the owners had the fugitives jailed in Boston while awaiting return to South Carolina, a Massachusetts court freed them on the grounds that slavery didn't exist in the state of Massachusetts. The owners complained to their governor in South Carolina, who complained to the governor of Massachusetts, who referred the matter to the Chief Justice of the State Superior Court. And this is his response, the Chief Justice's response. Quote, "If a man has a right to the services or labor of another who deserts his service, undoubtedly he has a right to take him up and carry him home to serve again, which has always been the case here, without any sanction from the magistrate." Slave owners, in other words, as one historian puts it, had no right to the state's help. That is to say, the right was self-enforcing, which meant it was a common law right of recaption. But what is that what the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution meant? It was first introduced to the Constitutional Convention on August 28, 1787, by Pierce Butler and Charles Pinckney, both of South Carolina, as an amendment to the extradition clause, which required the state executives to deliver up escaped felons or fugitives from justice. Their proposed amendment would require fugitive slaves and servants to be delivered up like criminals. James Wilson of Pennsylvania immediately objected. The South Carolina proposal, he complained, would oblige the executive of the state to do it. Roger Sherman of Connecticut saw, quote, no more propriety in the public seizing and rendering a slave or a servant than a horse. In short, the capture and return of fugitive slaves should be a private, not a public responsibility. Unlike fugitive criminals, the return of fugitive slaves was not the responsibility of state authorities. Butler withdrew the amendment and returned the next day with a separate fugitive slave clause, divorced from the extradition clause. And unlike the extradition clause, the fugitive slave clause contained no enforcement provision. It would be self-enforcing, which is to say, the fugitive slave clause created a common law right of recaption, not a constitutional right of property. Slaveholders were free to enter northern states to secure the return of fugitive slaves, but without any involvement of any government authorities, so long as they could do so without any breach of peace. Now, it should be obvious that there's a big difference between walking over to your neighbor's field to bring home your stray cow and chasing down a fugitive slave, a slave who had gone to the trouble of crossing the Ohio River to get to Cincinnati, or has escaped over the Mason-Dixon line from Virginia into Pennsylvania. Such a person was unlikely to submit passively at the appearance of someone claiming to be their owner or their owner's representatives. In such circumstances, there's very likely to be a breach of peace, and with that, the principle of self-enforcement went out the window and the majestic power of the law swept in. Beginning in the 1780s, one northern state after another passed statutes designed to protect the due process rights of accused fugitives, often to protect free blacks from being kidnapped into slavery on the pretext that they were fugitives. Northern state law was based on the presumption of freedom, and that meant that blacks accused of being fugitive slaves were entitled to due process. They could sue their would-be owners on a writ of habeas corpus. They were entitled to a jury trial. Southerners were angered by such laws and demanded more and more protections of their constitutional right to the recovery of their fugitive slaves. As I noted earlier, they claimed that their slaves were their legal property and that the Fugitive Slave Clause recognized their slaves as property and that property was not entitled to due process. Northern states responded in turn. They required slave catchers to provide extensive documentation to prove that they legally owned the person in question and that the person in question was indeed the right person. The slaveholders, in turn, demanded that the federal government step in and enforce their rights against the states that repeatedly interfered with the claim. The federal government did just that in the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which squeaked through Congress despite the opposition of the overwhelming majority of Northern representatives. Sure enough, the Fugitive Slave Law provoked a furious backlash all across the North. Northern legislatures responded by depriving slave catchers of the use of local jails to temporarily house their captives. Some states made it a crime for local police or sheriffs to assist in any way in the capture of accused fugitives. The Wisconsin legislature actually passed a law nullifying the federal statute. That was the legal reaction. There was also a massive extra-legal reaction. Federal commissioners who attempted to enforce the law were sometimes hounded out of town. Northern communities, especially black communities, banded together to thwart slave captures, often at gunpoint. Meanwhile, local police often stood by and did nothing. When Northern prosecutors did manage to arrest those who interfered with the fugitive slave renditions, Northern juries repeatedly refused to convict. All of this because the unambiguously pro-slavery Fugitive Slave Clause was in fact riddled with legal ambiguities that made conflict over the disposition of fugitive slaves the second major cause of the Civil War, alongside the dispute over slavery in the territories. Throughout the secession crisis, pro-slavery Southerners justified their withdrawal from the Union by claiming that the northern states had rendered the Fugitive Slave Clause null and void. And in one sense, they were right. Of the estimated 10,000 slaves who escaped to the North in the 1850s, only a few hundred were returned. The secessionists had a point. On the other hand, Northerners were right to complain that the slaveholders were claiming a constitutional right that the Constitution did not, in fact, recognize, that they were using the federal government to enforce a clause of the Constitution that conspicuously and deliberately lacked an enforcement clause, a clause that was supposed to be self-enforcing or, where there was a breach of peace, enforced by the states. It's worth pointing out here that when it came to the conflict over fugitive slaves, state rights was the northern position. The Constitution recognized slavery as something that existed only in the states where it was legal, and yet here were slave catchers coming into northern towns and cities, using the federal government, even the United States Army, to impose their slave system on unwilling and increasingly infuriated Northerners. By the 1850s then, pro-slavery Southerners and anti-slavery Northerners had developed two profoundly different interpretations of the U.S. Constitution, two interpretations that were fundamentally irreconcilable. And nowhere can we see this more clearly than in the infamous decision handed down by Chief Justice Roger Taney in 1857 in the Dred Scott case, and in the two dissenting opinions written by Justices Benjamin Curtis and John McLean. The suit originated when Dred Scott, likely at the urging of his wife Harriet, sued for his freedom in Missouri on the grounds that they had lived with their owner for several years in the state of Illinois, where the legislature had long since abolished slavery, and in Wisconsin territories where slavery was banned by Congress as part of the so-called Missouri Compromise. The case dragged through the courts for several years before landing at the U.S. Supreme Court, which finally ruled against Dred Scott and ordered him and his family back into slavery. Taney's decision for the court was a summary of radical pro-slavery constitutionalism. Dred Scott had no standing to sue in the federal court because he was not and could never be a citizen of the United States, because Black people were not and never could be citizens of the United States. When the nation was founded, Taney wrote, Black people, quote, had no rights a white man was bound to respect. Living for years in a free state made no difference because Dred Scott's status as a slave in Missouri overrode the presumption of freedom in Illinois. Living for an extended period of time in Wisconsin's territory made no difference either because Congress had no right to abolish slavery in the territory to begin with. In fact, Taney said, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Far from being empowered to ban slavery from the territories, he ruled Congress was constitutionally obligated to protect slavery in the territories. And why was that? Because Congress is obliged to protect property rights, and according to Taney, quote, the right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. Modern readers tend to focus on the racism of Taney's opinion, and that's perfectly understandable. But Taney wasn't invoking white supremacy simply because he was a white supremacist. His goal, his overriding purpose, was to destroy the premises of anti-slavery constitutionalism. The two dissenting justices, Benjamin Curtis and John McLean, understood this better than most of Taney's critics, and none were better positioned to defend the anti-slavery constitutional principles in their own opinions. I'm going to spend more time on those dissents because they are less well known than Taney's opinion, and because they represented the mainstream views of the Republican Party. In fact, the Republican Party printed tens of thousands of copies of those dissents and distributed them as Republican Party documents, and the Republican Party was going to take control over Congress and the presidency a few years later, so you got to know what they're thinking. Both dissenters argued that citizenship in the United States was a birthright regardless of your race. If you were born in the US, you were automatically a citizen of the state into which you were born, and the Constitution automatically conferred US citizenship on state citizens. Free Blacks were therefore citizens, and every citizen, quote, has the right to sue and is liable to be sued in the federal courts as a citizen of the state in which he resides. Scott's suit was therefore valid. Both Curtis and McLean agreed that the Constitution gave Congress the power to ban slavery from Wisconsin territory. It was free soil when Scott lived there, and the presumption of freedom applied. Indeed, even if Congress had not banned slavery from Wisconsin territory, it would still have been free soil because, as Curtis explained, quote, slavery can exist nowhere except under the authority of law. Where no such law exists, the presumption without regard to color is in favor of freedom. In addition, slavery was positively prohibited in the state of Illinois, and the courts had repeatedly ruled that a slave was automatically emancipated upon being carried voluntarily into a free state where the master is domiciled. So Scott had been doubly emancipated in both Wisconsin and in Illinois. And having been freed, he could never be re-enslaved. In legalese, the condition of slavery could not reattach once Scott was brought back to Missouri. That's because under the Constitution, a free person can never be enslaved. The Fifth Amendment decrees that no person can be deprived of liberty without due process of law. Once Scott was freed, he was freed forever. That's an important precedent for understanding what the Emancipation Proclamation is going to do. Moreover, Dred and Harriet Scott had been legally married in Wisconsin. Because slave marriages had no legal validity in the South, the re-enslavement of the Scots necessitated the destruction of a legal marriage. But marriage is a contract, Curtis pointed out, and if Missouri refused to recognize a legal marriage of the Scots, it would be impairing the obligation of a contract, a violation of the Constitution. Curtis noted that the very purpose of the Constitution, spelled out in the preamble, was to secure the blessings of liberty to everyone. Taney's claim that the Constitution was made exclusively by and for the white race was therefore a mere assumption, not warranted by anything in the Constitution, but contradicted by the opening declaration that it was ordained and established by the people of the United States. The egalitarian principles of the Declaration of Independence, both dissenting justices agreed, applied to blacks as well as whites. It would be unjust to the founders to allege that they intended to say that the creator of all men had endowed the white race exclusively with the universal natural rights which the Declaration of Independence proclaimed. Above all, Curtis and McLean insisted Taney was wrong to assert that slaves were property, no different from any other species of property, and that the Constitution recognized them as such. Divine law, natural law, the common law, and the Constitution all recognized slaves as persons, not property. In the provision respecting the slave trade, in fixing the ratio of representation, and in providing for the reclamation of fugitives from labor, McLean pointed out, slaves were referred to as persons, and in no other respect are they considered in the Constitution. Black persons are made property merely by the laws of individual states, and states had the power to do so. But McLean added, no such power has been given to Congress. A slave is not a mere chattel, he concluded. He bears the impress of his maker and is amenable to the laws of God and man. In short, Taney was not relying on the Constitution as it had been drafted in the 1780s. He was invoking the pro-slavery Constitution of the 1850s, just as the dissenting justices were invoking the anti-slavery Constitution of the 1850s. This is the crucial context you need to understand. You need in order to understand what Taney was up to when he handed down his decision in early 1857. A few months earlier, in November of 1856, the new anti-slavery Republican candidate John C. Fremont had done surprisingly well in his campaign for the presidency. The platform on which Fremont ran repeatedly invoked the principles of anti-slavery constitutionalism. That's what Taney wanted to shut down, in effect, banning the Republican Party. Obviously, it didn't work. 4 years later, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln succeeded where Fremont had not. And whatever else there is to say about Lincoln, this much we can safely say: his politics were planted firmly within the anti-slavery constitutional tradition. The various anti-slavery policies he endorsed over the years were likewise grounded in anti-slavery constitutionalism. In 1830, in his first public statement on slavery, Lincoln endorsed abolition in Washington, D.C., claiming that Congress had the power to do so, quote, under the Constitution. Even then, Lincoln was responding to pro-slavery senators, in particular John C. Calhoun and James Henry Hammond, both of South Carolina, both of whom denied that Congress had the power to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., because to do so would violate their rights of property in slaves. Already in the 1830s, Lincoln disagreed. In the 1840s, during his one term in the House of Representatives, Lincoln voted repeatedly to ban slavery in all the territory recently taken from Mexico. And in the 1830s, he went further, arguing that Congress not only could ban slavery in the territories, but it had a duty to do so. During that same decade, Lincoln called for revisions of the much despised Fugitive Slave Act, revisions that would ensure that no one, he said, was, quote, deprived of the privileges and immunities to which all citizens are entitled. The statement makes no sense unless Lincoln was assuming that free blacks were citizens of the United States. As he made clear during the secession crisis, that meant due process rights for accused fugitives in states where the presumption of freedom prevailed. Perhaps most importantly, the thing that got him the Republican nomination for president in 1860 was a speech he gave at Cooper Union declaring unequivocally that there is no such thing as a constitutional right of property in slaves. Wherever the Constitution refers to slaves, he pointed out, it refers to them as persons, never as property. The platform on which Lincoln was elected in 1860 repeatedly quoted the Constitution. The preamble promising liberty to all, the Fifth Amendment guarantee of due process rights, the privileges and immunities of citizenship clause, the principle of fundamental human equality announced in the Declaration of Independence was, the Republicans declared, embodied in the Constitution. Their platform likewise denied that there was a constitutional right of property in slaves. At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that when Frederick Douglass changed his mind about the Constitution, he seemed to have jumped from one extreme to the other, from Garrison's view of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document to the opposite view of the Constitution as an abolitionist document. But if you take the full measure of mainstream anti-slavery constitutionalism, I think there's another way to look at where Douglass ended up. His interpretation of the Constitution depended on the same clauses cited by anti-slavery constitutionalists all across the North: the preamble, the Fifth Amendment, the privileges and immunities of citizenship clause, the territorial clause. It's just that Douglass drew inferences from those clauses that went one crucial step beyond anti-slavery politicians. He concluded that the Constitution so thoroughly valorized freedom over slavery that it empowered Congress to abolish slavery in the southern states. For nearly all anti-slavery politicians, that was a step too far. But that should not blind us to the fact that Douglass's position, for all its radicalism, shared much more with Lincoln's anti-slavery constitutionalism than it did with Garrison's pro-slavery constitutionalism. They were much closer than they seemed, and the proof was in the result. With those anti-slavery constitutional principles in mind, Lincoln and the Republicans took control of the executive and legislative branches of government in early 1861 and proceeded to ban slavery from all the territories, to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., and to suppress the Atlantic slave trade. More consequentially, they nullified the fugitive slave law by refusing to return slaves who had escaped into Union lines on the grounds that by seceding from the Union, the slave states had forfeited their constitutional right of recapture. And to top it off, they invoked the war powers of the Constitution to begin emancipating those same escaped slaves. It's worth pointing out that at no point did Congress ever abolish slavery in the states. It never violated the federal consensus, and yet the end result of their crusade was the abolition of slavery in every state. Some years ago, when I started speaking and writing about anti-slavery constitutionalism, skeptics would respond by asking me a counterfactual question. Everything you say may be true, they declare, but would anti-slavery constitutionalism have led to abolition without a civil war? To which my answer is, without anti-slavery constitutionalism, there would have been no civil war. If everybody in the North agreed with Tawney, or for that matter with William Lloyd Garrison, there would have been no reason for a civil war. If the pro-slavery Constitution was uniformly subscribed to as the law of the land, nobody in the North would have been calling for a ban on slavery in the territories. Nobody would have demanded due process rights for accused fugitive slaves. Nobody would have denied that slaves were a constitutionally protected species of property. Nobody would have demanded that the federal government use all the constitutional power at its disposal to put slavery, in Lincoln's words, on a course of ultimate extinction. The federal government had no power at its disposal to move against slavery. If the Constitution was simply a pro-slavery document, it's impossible to imagine a civil war. Okay, the skeptics might agree. But once the war started, how could anti-slavery constitutionalism possibly lead to abolition? And my answer is similar. If anti-slavery constitutionalists did not believe that the seceded states automatically forfeited their right to the return of fugitive slaves, if they did not believe that the slaves who ran to Union lines in so doing ran into free territory, if they did not believe that the war powers entitled the commander-in-chief to emancipate such fugitive slaves as a military necessity, there would have been no emancipation. If instead, Lincoln and the Republicans agreed with Jefferson Davis that an Emancipation Proclamation was unconstitutional, then hundreds of thousands of slaves would not have been freed by the war, and there would have been no path, not even a crooked path, to the 13th Amendment. Here then is my reply to the skeptics. Anti-slavery constitutionalism caused the Civil War. Anti-slavery constitutionalism justified wartime emancipation, and wartime emancipation made the 13th Amendment possible. All of which leaves us to ponder one of the great paradoxes of American legal history. It took an anti-slavery constitution to get us an anti-slavery constitution. Thank you.
Professor Oakes, thank you so much. We have time for a couple of questions. Do we have questions? Jim is over here and Kira is here. Right over here. I got it.
Thank you. Great speech, by the way. Real quick question. Was there any discussion on the economic situation? Like Ben Franklin had said that it's actually not economically viable to have slavery. Like he did the math on it and said that this is not going to work. Was there any discussion also on that? Like just economics also, if you can talk to that just for a second?
Yeah, lots of talk about the economics of slavery. Anti-slavery Republicans like Abraham Lincoln accepted Franklin's and Adam Smith's interpretation of slavery as an economically backward, inefficient system, right? And they believed that if you bottled slavery up, didn't let it expand, it would eventually die of its own accord. The metaphor they used, it's the title of one of my books, it's called The Scorpion Sting. Like a scorpion circled by fire, it would kill itself, it would sting itself, right? So they believed that. The Southerners believed, that cotton was king. They thought, grass would grow on the streets of every city in the North if they didn't have cotton. Turned out, no, that's not what happened. The Northerners weren't making war on cotton, they were making war on slavery, on the assumption that if slavery were abolished, the freed people would be much more efficient at producing cotton as free laborers than they were as slave laborers. So that notion of the economic backwardness of slave economies is built into the Republican project, anti-slavery project.
Over, Mr. Towns.
Great question.
I have a question.
Sure.
As you read about this, the Civil War and the factors that went into it, it's all much more complicated than good, bad, and north, south. You mentioned the views of the anti-slavery movement were starting to develop in the 1840s, 1850s. Just curious, what are your thoughts behind what drove that? The idea that people that didn't look like the majority weren't property, the fact, was this some overriding sense of good? Was there a political factor going through? I'm curious as to what you think drove that view in the North, because there always seem to be underlying tones to what appears to be good. So I'm just wondering if there's any research on that.
That's a very good question. The way I have tended to answer that over the years is to point out that an intellectual historian will take the anti-slavery arguments and break them down into different. There's an economic argument against slavery. There's a political argument against the disproportionate influence of the slaveholders in American politics. So it's a political argument. There's a moral argument. There's constitutional arguments. There's a bunch of them. The problem is you can't apply those intellectual history categories to individual people. Because if you believed that slavery was economically backward, you were likely to believe that it was immoral. You were likely to believe that it was unconstitutional, or that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document. You were likely to believe all the other things, that the slave power was disproportionate, influential. So they all say that the principle of fundamental human equality in the Declaration of Independence is incompatible with slavery. That's, all men are created equal is not a description of reality. It's a moral precept, right? You hold that up, right? If they're all saying that, then there's an irreducible moral element to an argument that has many other components to it.
I'm going to turn the clock ahead, and my question is to current times. And the question goes like this: I am an educator, and I teach history as one of them. How would you explain to parents who do not want their children to learn about slavery, what went on, or the Civil War, reasons that they should continue it and not take it out of the school system? Because it's a very difficult thing to think about and discuss. So what are your feelings on that?
As someone who has spent 45 years studying slavery and anti-slavery, the idea that the study of my life should not be in you cannot understand American history if you don't understand what slavery was, the role it played in American history, the role anti-slavery played in American history. You can't understand the Civil War. You can't understand how slavery got abolished, what that meant, what that didn't mean, like that. You just can't understand American history without understanding slavery. I don't get that argument.
That is a perfect place, I think, to end tonight. And you understand it better because of Professor Oakes. Thank you. Thank you. We will be publishing our calendar of lectures in the next couple of weeks, but this is our last program in 2022. Have a great holiday, and we'll see you in January. Thank you.